Thank you for downloading this podcast from the BBC World Service. I'm Sandra Canthal, and in this edition of The Why Factor, I'll be asking if we really do take courage from a crowd. When a group of people come together in one place, they form a crowd. Complete strangers make a connection. This bond becomes a shared identity. It can unite those who have little but proximity in common. Individuals who feel vulnerable alone become powerful together.
My body, my choice! Her body, her choice! My body, my choice! Her body.
There's almost nothing more powerful than the feeling that you're not alone.
This is the BBC World Service. I'm Sandra Canthal, and in this edition of The Why Factor, why we take courage from a crowd.
I think it's time we stop. Children, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down.
In the digital age, you can go from a Facebook post or a few Twitter accounts and some hashtags to a large crowd and very quickly. You can just get together and there could be a million of you in the streets.
We are the people! We are the story! This is the whole wide world!
I'm Zeynep Tüfekçi. I'm an associate professor at the University of North Carolina, and I'm also the author of Twitter and Tear Gas, The Power and Fragility of Network Protest.
She also calls herself a techno-sociologist. She studies the effects of social media on political movements. Professor Tüfekçi is drawn to protest marches. She joined anti-war demonstrations in New York in 2003, flew back to her native Turkey in 2013 to study the Gezi Park protest in Istanbul, and she was one of the millions who took part in the women's marches this past January in her current home, North Carolina. Do you like being in crowds?
I do. I really enjoy participating. For me, it's always I'm part studying and part trying to enjoy the moment, but I'm always thinking about it. I'm always aware of that feeling of euphoria that you get from people who think like you, because it really is powerful to feel like, oh, there are all these people who believe in things I do, and here they are, and they've shown up.
I asked her, when people are swept up in a moment, do they really take courage from that crowd?
Of course they do. I mean, this is a very basic insight of social science, basically, since its beginning. A core tenet of how humans operate is that we're social creatures. If people start thinking that they have other people who think like them, that they belong with other people, that they're not the only ones who feel a certain way, it's very empowering. It's very strengthening, and it makes people take risks that they may not otherwise take.
In the early months of 2011, Egyptians rose up to protest against the government of Hosni Mubarak. In Tahrir Square, thousands of people were injured. Many lost their lives. But after 18 days, the government fell. It was political protest at its most dramatic. Among the demonstrators was the activist Hisham Kassim, who described to the BBC what it felt like the day the government fell.
It's like Egypt won the World Cup. It's amazing.
6 years later, he can still recall those moments vividly.
The first time in my life I joined a demonstration was on 28 January 2011. I was standing with one of the crowds that were trying to enter Tahrir Square. And around 5 o'clock, it looked like Mubarak had won another day. Crowd began to disperse. And I started walking home. Took me about 20 minutes. And when I got home, I turned on the TV, and the same crowd I had been standing with had basically entered the headquarters of Mubarak's National Democratic Party and torched it. And it was a shock. It was suddenly, the balance of things was changing. I had never imagined a thing like that would happen. I remember next morning leaving home and heading to the square, feeling empowered by all of that no, Mubarak had not won another day. And there was a column of tanks from my house all the way to Tahrir Square. And for a sec, I wasn't sure how to react. Should I just go home and stay there for 2-3 days with the TV on to find out how things are developing, what the military's position is going to be? I did not want to find out by being taken into a side street and executed. And then I was encouraged by the crowds heading towards the square. So I decided to join them, went into the square, and it was basically the standoff. People were empowering each other, the safety of the crowd, and of course there were different moments.
Do you think it was the power of this crowd that brought about such monumental change in Egypt?
Certainly, but people always think of Tahrir Square. Actually, the crowds began in Suez, and it moved to Fayoum and several other places before it came to Cairo. And in Alexandria, there really used to be demonstrations exceeding 1 million people. Crowds were across the country. This was not something that was happening solely in Tahrir Square. I don't think Mubarak would have lost half an hour's sleep if it was only that square. But across the country, all over, the demonstrations were happening, the crowds were appearing, and the one thing being there was clear: they are not going home.
It's often euphoric that when you are in a protest, it's one of the sort of most empowering moments in most people's lives. You feel like you belong, you feel there's all these people out there. Even though you don't really know them, you feel this kinship with them. It feels like a kind of family. Often people think that protests lead to social change because politicians see large numbers of people and they decide to do something, and that's not true. The reason protests lead to social change, when they do, is that if people find one another like that and form that bond and form that kinship, and then they can go on to do other things from that kinship, that feeling of family, that feeling of belonging, that's what leads to social change.
On that day, I felt every Egyptian needs to step out there and fill a space. I did not feel I'm one of the leaders, even though I had been in Mubarak's opposition for 20 years. But I felt I should be one man standing there amongst that crowd.
If people were to rise up again and crowds were to reconvene in the square, would you join them?
Yeah, I definitely would.
The crowd that gathers for a demonstration or a concert or a football match has a different dynamic than a large number of people converging on a shopping mall or getting through the morning rush hour. Crowds have a common social identity. In a crowded space, we are a collection of strangers.
Sometimes if you get onto a tube train in London, which is densely crowded, it's an extremely uncomfortable situation. You feel really, really uncomfortable in close proximity to all these people, no eye contact, no conversation. It's a really, really alienating experience.
Clifford Stott is a professor of social psychology at Keele University in the north of England.
Translate that into the Kop, which is the terrace behind the goal at Anfield, the stadium of Liverpool Football Club, when you're a Liverpool fan. And in those situations, being close to other people who are like you is actually a really, really rewarding experience. And when that goal goes in, these people around you who are in other ways complete strangers to you, suddenly you can embrace them, they become your closest friends, and to be close to them and to be crowded within them is a really, really rewarding experience. So the experience of being densely crowded into a crowd is fundamentally different depending upon the level of identification that you have with the people around you.
Professor Stott has a very specific area of academic interest.
My career focuses on researching crowds, specifically the question of why do crowds riot? I began my PhD career by simply going along to crowd events and being part of the crowd.
This particular field of study means his days at the office are very different and sometimes a bit more dangerous than your typical desk job.
Crowds aren't amenable to traditional scientific methodology. It's very difficult in the middle of a riot to run up to somebody and say, "Excuse me, would you mind filling out this little questionnaire for me?"
Getting around this obstacle has landed him in some very threatening situations.
I I've been part of a crowd in Marseille of England fans that were involved in rioting and attacked by local Marseille youths, and to be honest, that's probably the most frightening experiences I've ever had as a researcher, where I was pushed out onto a street and surrounded by a group of upwards of 50 local youths who were armed with baseball bats and knives and so on, and I genuinely at that point feared for my life, because in that context there were very few choices available to me. The first was to find other England fans around me and to what we might call mob up. And secondly, all of a sudden, some of the most aggressive and confrontational England fans at that point in time became somebody who was my best friend, somebody I knew and wanted to be around because they would help me in that situation to cope with the threat that I was being faced with. So it's a risky place to be. It can be dangerous, but by being in those circumstances, you get direct, first-hand understanding of how they're coming about.
Football crowds erupting in violence is one of the more common images we associate with crowds. We remember these events so vividly because they are, in fact, rare.
If you consider the idea that somewhere in the region of 42 million people a year go to football crowds in the UK alone, and there's hardly any major confrontation or disorder that occurs in those particular situations. It's just every now and then we get these events, which are often very high profile, newsworthy events, where this language gets deployed to try to make sense of those events, and that language is very, very unhelpful.
I love crowds. If there's a crowd, I'll just jump into it.
Michael Bond is a science writer whose latest book is called The Power of Others.
A crowd of people is more than the sum of their parts. People derive strength from sharing something. The traditional barriers fall away, and it's all about the thing you are sharing, the thing you have in common, and it's not about your differences, which seem inconsequential at that time.
But if someone asks you to describe a crowd, what would be the first words you think of? Would mob, uncontrollable, or mindless be on that list? One of the most recognized books on the early study of crowd psychology was published in 1841 by the Scottish journalist Charles Mackay. Its title, Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. Why is it that our portrayal of the crowd is so often angry or dehumanizing?
This language first arose really around the French Revolution, end of the 18th century, when there were a lot of occasions when huge numbers of people on the streets and there was a lot of destruction, and it was caught up in the violence of that. And ever since then, in popular discourse, crowds have been associated with this idea that they are somehow mad, or they bring out distasteful sides of people, and that somehow people are encouraged to behave in ways they wouldn't usually. The language is all to do with that, how people think that's how crowds affect human behavior. They make people mad or bad or dangerous. The madness of crowds, it's an easy one to run with, but it's not really true. It's not really accurate in most cases.
When crowds do descend into violence, there's usually a specific trigger, something that ricochets in unpredictable trajectories. It could be action by the police or a hostile group looking for a fight, as Clifford Stott described, or mismanagement that can lead to overcrowding and panic with tragic consequences. How to prevent these things from happening is the objective of Professor Stott's work. However, the majority of large gatherings we are likely to encounter are not threatening events. And according to Professor Stott, if we do find ourselves in a crowd, we're likely to behave...
well, peacefully. People behave like they do normally, because crowds aren't an aberration. They're actually normal situations where people continue to behave normally. Crowds are also places that challenge the status quo. That sense of being together in a group can be deeply empowering for people, and importantly, shift power relations that in normal everyday life, when we're marginalised and individualised, we feel disempowered. So crowds are places where we can go to feel connected.
And those places can be anywhere. In the age of the internet, when we gather as a crowd, we don't have to physically stand side by side. Sander van der Linden is the director of the Social Decision Making Lab at Cambridge University in the UK.
An online crowd can still be empowering in the sense that, if you're getting lots of likes or hits. And it's fascinating because in some way you might think, what does these clicks and likes mean, right? But nowadays people who are so used to being online actually means a lot to people, right? And so I think the online environment now actually has the power to induce feelings on people. And when you talk about viral campaigns, what I call the psychology of consent is a crucial aspect of it. So campaigns tend to go viral when there's enough social momentum for something to spread. And how does that happen? It happens when a certain campaign reaches a social tipping point. So let's say somebody has shared something 1 million times or 1 billion times, then that becomes a signal in itself that attracts more people, which increases the consensus, which then has more people joining the cause, and other people join, and this how these things grow and get bigger and attract more people.
10 years ago, the activist Tarana Burke started a movement called Me Too to call attention to the victims of sexual abuse. After the scandal involving the movie producer Harvey Weinstein broke, it became a global phenomenon when the actress Alyssa Milano used it as a hashtag to prompt women everywhere to come forward with their stories of sexual harassment. The number of people who responded was staggering. Facebook reported over 12 million posts, comments and replies engaged with the Me Too conversation in 24 hours. Sandra Mueller, a French journalist living and working in New York, wanted to contribute.
I was thinking about Weinstein because everybody spoke about Weinstein at this time. I was speaking with a friend of mine about what we faced in our job, and I thought, okay, maybe I have to create something for a woman who have the same situation than an actress in Hollywood. And I created the message, balance ton porc. In French, it means expose your pig. And for me, it means you have to give the name, give me the story, what happens to you with harassment.
Sandra Mueller created her hashtag to offer French women and men their own platform so they could bring their stories out in the open. And she did it because she too has a story to tell.
I was in Cannes Festival, it was a few years ago, and the guy was a director of a channel. We were at the same party, and I started to speak with him, and he told me, your newspaper have a lot of consideration for you and a lot of respect. And I told him, oh, thank you so much. And after that, he started to tell me, yes, I have a consideration, a lot of respect, but, and also you are beautiful, you have dark black hair, and you have big breasts, and I want you all the night. And I was, oh my God, he's crazy.
At this point, Sandra called a friend so she could create a safe escape route from the party. But the echoes of the event stayed with her for years.
As a victim, you don't realize that this kind of situation, at first you want to hide it. You think, okay, I'm the wrong person. Maybe I should have laughed and take it easy. And after, you want to speak about that. And when you have the courage to speak about that, it takes a long time.
The Me Too campaign is a vivid example of spreading courage through sheer numbers. Does Sandra think that women are galvanized to come forward by the collective determination of the crowd?
Yes, absolutely. That's what happened. Before we were victims, and now we're not victims anymore. It's pushed them to make some concrete action. They are not scared to speak about their pork. You know what I mean? It's like a group situation. So that's good because women, they are not alone anymore. They feel that they are together.
Many women will have gained confidence from that sense of togetherness. So much so that the American Time magazine has just named the silence breakers of the Me Too campaign as its Person of the Year. However, with any newfound power comes the responsibility to be watchful of where it can lead.
This feeling of not feeling like you're just one person and that you belong and that you have something important that other people share. The trick is this works regardless of the views you have. So it works for Egyptian dissidents, but it also works for white supremacists, right? It also works for pretty much any group you can think of if they're able to get together and feel like they're not alone and form a community. It strengthens them.
Is there any chance that people stop using your hashtag for what you intended it and start using it as a method of retribution to anyone they don't like, and tumbles into being a witch hunt.
Oh, yes, absolutely. It happens. Some people, yes, they try in France to take the hashtag to deliver their own message. I think that people, they are not stupid and they can see that. But, maybe it will stop when there won't be any name to give. Maybe.
It's too early to tell if the long-term impact of Sandra's campaign and those like hers will lead to permanent change in our culture. But the past does offer us a guide to what is possible. Crowds can form spontaneously or be organised affairs. The crucial element is that shared identity, being together in one place at one time for one purpose. The meeting point which draws us in can be anywhere, such as, for example, on the top of a wall.
When the Berlin Wall came down, that's a good example of how crowds affect social change in a pretty dramatic way. It started with a few people who had the courage, but very quickly you had other people joining them, and there's this strong sense of shared identity. We're here because we want this to happen, and we're all in it together. And you can see here the parallel with the Me Too campaign, because it's taken a few people to stand up and demonstrate that they have the courage to share their experiences, and that makes it a lot easier for other people to step up on that wall, if you like.
What's the difference between the madness of crowds and the wisdom of crowds?
Judgment. It just matters the judgment, really. Crowds are at the heart of our society, in particular in the way our society changes. We need to understand that crowds can be problematic, but they can also be very, very positive, a force for good. Because if we really want to get to grips with understanding how and why crowds behave like they do, we have to recognise that the society that we live in plays a big role in creating the situations where crowds act positively or negatively.
You've been listening to The Why Factor on the BBC World Service. I'm Sandra Canthall, and this programme was mixed by James Beard. If you like this series, please do listen to some of our past programmes, such as Why We Feel Loneliness and Why We Support Sports Clubs. You can find these all on our website. We'll give the last word to the hashtag creator Sandra Mueller, describing how she feels about being one woman who passed her courage onto a crowd.
Maybe when I will die, I will think, okay, I left something to people, and I think everybody on his planet, on his earth, wants to leave a trace. So maybe it will be my personal trace.